In 1974, a woman in America could be a doctor, a CEO, or the smartest person in the room, and still need a man's signature to open a credit card in her own name. Not 100 years ago. Not in some distant chapter of history you skimmed in school. 50 years. That's it. 50 years since the law itself stopped treating a woman's income, on its own, as real enough to count. Picture it plainly. A woman walks into a bank. She has a paycheck, she has a job, she has a plan. And the loan officer slides a form across the counter that asks for the name of her husband, her father, or her brother, because her signature alone isn't considered enough collateral for her own future. That wasn't an insult hurled at one unlucky woman on one unlucky day. That was the system. Every bank, every lender, every institution that decided who gets to build something and who gets left standing outside the door with nothing but a paycheck that doesn't count as proof of anything. It took an act of Congress to change it. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, signed into law in 1974, made it illegal for a lender to deny a woman credit, a mortgage, or a business loan on the basis of her sex on its own for the first time in American history. Before that law existed, a woman's income could be discounted by a bank almost at will, regardless of her job title or her salary, simply because the underwriting rules assumed a woman's earnings were less permanent, less reliable, less real than a man's. 50 years is not ancient history. It's one law inside one lifetime, standing between where women's financial rights are now and a system that, by default, didn't count them at all. This video is not about how much money women make. It's about something almost nobody explains clearly. Money and wealth are not the same thing. Income is what lands in your account every 2 weeks. Wealth is what's left standing after everything else is subtracted, your assets minus your debts, the number that actually determines whether you're free or fragile when something goes wrong. And there's a framework built by a financial analyst named Nick Maggiulli that maps wealth not as a single finish line, but as a ladder with distinct levels. Each level runs on different rules. The habits that get you off the bottom rung, cutting expenses, watching every dollar, refusing every unnecessary purchase, start to matter less and less by the time you're climbing toward the next one, where the real leverage comes from owning assets instead of just saving cash. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud. That ladder wasn't built by accident. It took shape inside a financial world that legally treated women as dependents until roughly half a century ago. And 50 years is nowhere near enough time to fully rewrite who gets taught to climb it and how. The advice that gets handed to women today still carries the fingerprints of that history. Endless tips about coupons and budgeting and cutting out lattes, while the real architecture of wealth, the ownership, the leverage, the compounding quietly stays out of the conversation entirely. You can be financially responsible your entire life and still be handed the wrong instructions for the level you're actually trying to reach. If you've ever felt like you were doing everything right, working hard, saving what you could, avoiding debt, following every rule you were ever taught, and still watching your net worth crawl instead of climb, this is why. It's not a discipline problem. It's a blueprint problem. And somewhere along the way, you were handed an incomplete one. Think about a woman named Elena, 34 years old, marketing director in Denver, base salary of $108,000, no debt she can't handle, a retirement account she contributes to religiously every single paycheck. On paper, she's doing better than most people her age, in any gender. Her friends assume she's set. Her parents brag about her at dinner. But when she actually sits down one night and calculates her real net worth, every asset minus every liability, no rounding up, no flattering estimates, she lands around $91,000, higher than the typical unmarried woman in America whose net worth hovers closer to $58,000. But still nowhere near what a six-figure income should have produced by 34. If income and wealth actually worked the way she'd always assumed they did. Elena isn't undisciplined. She isn't bad with money. She has never missed a payment in her life. And that's exactly what makes her story worth sitting with. Because if the standard financial advice actually worked the way it's sold, a woman like Elena should already be several rungs higher. She followed the script. The script was incomplete. Nobody ever told her that the difference between saving well and building wealth is ownership, assets that grow whether or not she's actively working, and that almost nothing in her financial education ever pointed her toward that shift. That gap between what a woman earns and what she actually keeps, protects, and grows isn't random, and it isn't a personal failing. It traces back to a set of interlocking mechanisms, legal, historical, structural, that most personal finance content simply never mentions because naming them is uncomfortable and selling budgeting templates is easy. Nobody wants to tell you the ladder itself has missing rungs built into it. It's easier to just tell you to make coffee at home. Here's the promise of this video. We're going to walk the real levels of wealth, the ones defined by net worth rather than paycheck size, and we're going to name specifically where and why the ladder gets harder to climb for women, not with vague outrage, not with slogans, but with the actual mechanisms behind the gap. The marriage transitions that can erase decades of quiet progress in a single year, and the investing gap that costs 6 figures over a lifetime without anyone ever noticing it happening while it happens. And then we're going to talk about the shift already underway, a redistribution of wealth so large it's being called the biggest in American history, and why understanding these levels right now determines whether you ride that wave or watch it happen around you, again, without a seat at the table. This isn't a video about blame. Nobody sat in a room and voted to keep you stuck at level 3. It's a video about visibility, because once you can actually see the architecture, the levels, the transitions, the leverage points, you stop mistaking a system's problem for a character flaw. And that shift, small as it sounds on paper, is the entire difference between staying exactly where you are and finally climbing. Let's start with the ladder itself, because before you can climb it, you have to know in real numbers what it's actually made of, and where you're really standing on it right now. Here's the ladder in real numbers. Level 1 is under $10,000 in net worth survival mode, where a single car repair can trigger a cascade. Level 2, $10,000 to $100,000, is where you stop flinching at the grocery bill. Level 3, $100,000 to $1 million, is where most of the American middle class actually lives, and it's the level where the entire game is supposed to change, from saving your way up to owning your way up. Level 4 starts at $1 million and climbs into the tens of millions, running almost entirely on assets working while you sleep. Elena sits solidly inside Level 3. So does about 4 in 10 American households. The real question is why so many women get stuck orbiting the lower half of that level instead of climbing through it. Start with the first mechanism, and it's not exotic. It's dependency. In a large national survey of coupled adults, more than a third of women in relationships describe themselves as financially dependent on their partner, 15% completely, another 20% partially. Among mothers with a child under 18, that climbs past 4 in 10. For men in the same survey, it's roughly 1 in 4. That gap isn't about who works harder. It's about who ends up holding the joint accounts, the shared credit history, the retirement contributions filed under one name instead of 2. Dependency isn't dangerous by itself. Plenty of healthy households run on one primary earner, and there's nothing wrong with that. It becomes dangerous the moment the relationship changes and the financial architecture doesn't move with it. And relationships change more often and more suddenly than any of us like to plan for. Picture a woman I'll call Patricia, the kind of story that shows up again and again in the research. 58, high school administrator outside Cincinnati, married 29 years. She and her husband built what looked, from the outside, like textbook level 3 stability, a paid-down home, 2 retirement accounts, a shared brokerage account he managed because he was better with the numbers. Then, 2 years ago, they divorced. Not over money, over the kind of quiet erosion that happens after 3 decades. In the 12 months that followed, researchers tracking this exact transition, using the same long-running National Health and Retirement Survey the government uses to study aging Americans, found women going through a late-life divorce see their standard of living drop by an average of 45% in that first year. Men in the same study, 21%. Not double the hardship, more than double. Patricia isn't a story about poor planning. She had a financial advisor. She had retirement accounts. What she didn't have was her own independent grip on the mechanics. Because for 29 years, the system quietly assigned that role to someone else, and nothing about a healthy marriage forces you to notice that until the marriage itself becomes the risk. This is exactly where the ladder logic earns its keep, and it's not comforting. At level 2, dependency is survivable. There's not much to lose. At level 3, it's a structural vulnerability because there's finally something real to lose, and half of shared isn't guaranteed to mean half of understood. Now the second mechanism, quieter because it doesn't need a crisis to do its damage. It's the investing gap. Recent data from one of the largest brokerages in the country found 71% of women now own investments in the stock market, up 18% from the year before. Real progress. But when that same research asked those women if they'd call themselves an investor, only 64% said yes, versus 76% of men who invest. Women are twice as likely to describe their own investing knowledge as non-existent, even when their portfolio says otherwise. That hesitation has a price, and it's not abstract. Take $200 a month, invested every month for 30 years, at an average annual return of 9.5%, a realistic long-run market assumption, never a guarantee. That grows to just over $406,000. Leave the same $200 a month in a typical savings account earning about 1%, and 30 years gets you just under $84,000. Same discipline, same monthly amount, same 30 years. The gap, just over $322,000. Not because one woman worked harder, but because one of them was sitting inside the market and the other was sitting outside it, waiting to feel ready. That's the part almost nobody says directly. The investing gap isn't a confidence problem you fix with a pep talk. It's a compounding problem, and compounding doesn't wait for you to feel like an investor. It only checks whether your money is in the market or out of it. If you're recognizing your own numbers somewhere in Elena's or Patricia's, this is the moment to hit subscribe because we map exactly this kind of hidden mechanism every week, and the next one connects straight to what's coming. You might already be pushing back on some of this, and you'd be right to. Women have historically been sold worse products, charged higher fees relative to portfolio size, and steered toward overly conservative allocations by an industry that spent most of its history assuming women needed protecting from risk instead of educating about it. Caution about that industry isn't a character flaw. But there's a difference between being selective about who manages your money and staying out of the market entirely. And the $322,000 gap we just did the math on is what settles that, not who's careful and who isn't. Caution about advisors is wisdom. Caution about markets, stretched over decades, is the tax nobody itemizes. And the research that does exist keeps landing in the same place. Once women invest, they don't underperform men. If anything, they trend towards steadier, better risk-adjusted returns, largely because they trade less and panic sell less. The gap isn't a skill gap, it's a permission gap. Nobody handed most women the internal permission to call themselves an investor, so a lot of very capable women never gave themselves the title, and the title turned out to matter more than anyone told them it would. Zoom out. Dependency delays a woman's independent financial fluency. The investing gap delays her asset ownership. Both compound in the exact years, 30s, 40s, 50s, when compounding does the most work. By the time Patricia's divorce hit, she wasn't just losing half a marriage. She was losing decades of a head start she never fully had, because the accounts had one name on the login even when both names were on the mortgage. One more layer needs naming honestly because it explains why so many capable women manage money reactively instead of proactively. The wealth management industry itself remains overwhelmingly built by one demographic. Only 12 to 15% of portfolio managers worldwide are women. That's not a coincidence. It means the default advice engine most women encounter wasn't built with their income timelines or their risk conversations centered as the default case, and it shows up in the numbers. Study after study on women going through divorce, widowhood, or a sudden inheritance finds that 7 or 8 out of 10 leave the advisor they inherited from the relationship within about a year. Not because the advisor was incompetent, because the relationship was never really with them in the first place. Here's the practical insight underneath all of this. Financial fluency isn't a personality trait some women have and others don't. It's a set of specific learnable mechanics. Reading your own net worth statement without flinching, knowing exactly what's in your name versus what's shared, understanding what your money is actually invested in instead of trusting a vague sense that it's handled. Elena's problem wasn't income. Patricia's problem wasn't intelligence. Both trace back to the same root, mechanics that were technically accessible to them, but never actually transferred. Because the system defaults to routing that knowledge toward whoever the household assumes is the numbers person. None of this happened because women were careless. Structural gaps, relational, behavioral, institutional, sit quietly underneath a ladder that assumes everyone started climbing from the same rung with the same tools at the same time. They didn't. And right now, a shift is coming that's about to hand an entire generation of women more control over capital than any generation before them has ever held. The only question left is whether they'll be standing on solid ground when it arrives, or scrambling to catch up like Patricia did. Here's the shift. Over the next couple of decades, roughly $124 trillion is projected to change hands in America. Parents to children, spouses to spouses, one generation to the next. Banking industry projections put women on track to hold around 70% of it. Not because a policy changed, not because the ladder got redesigned, because of something simpler. Women live longer than their husbands on average, so an enormous share of that money lands eventually in a woman's hands, whether she was ever taught to hold it or not. Every mechanism we just walked through, the dependency, the investing gap, the advisor built around someone else's name, was a story about access. This is a story about arrival. The money is coming regardless. The only open question is whether it lands on a woman who spent years building the fluency to receive it, or on a woman standing exactly where Patricia stood 2 years ago, holding accounts she never learned to read, next to a title, investor, she never gave herself permission to claim. There's a second, quieter gap worth naming before we get to what to do about any of it. It's not just retirement savings. Social Security itself pays women meaningfully less. On average, a woman 65 or older collects a few $100s less a month than a man in the same position. Not a different formula. The same wage gap compounding through every paycheck since her 20s, plus the years a caregiving stretch pulls out of the workforce, permanently shrinking the benefit calculation. The gap doesn't stop when you stop working. It follows you into the one system you spent your whole career assuming would finally be equal. You might be thinking, that's the government's math, not mine. What does any of this actually change for me today? Fair question. Here's the honest answer. None of these numbers move on their own. They move when you touch 3 specific things. Know your real net worth, not your income. One number, assets minus liabilities. No rounding up, the same 20-minute exercise that told Elena the truth her paycheck was hiding. If any account, any password, any piece of the financial picture in your household lives only in someone else's head, get your name and your understanding on it this month, not eventually. That's the one decision that would have changed Patricia's first year post-divorce the most. Not more money, more visibility into money that already existed. And if you're sitting mostly in cash, start with whatever amount doesn't feel reckless. That $322,000 gap from earlier, $200 a month, 30 years, market versus savings account, wasn't built by starting big. It was built by starting decades early. One more, easy to skip because it never feels urgent until it is. If you're the one more likely to outlive a partner or more likely to inherit, ask the boring questions now: where the accounts are, who the advisor is, what the actual plan is, while it's a calm conversation, not a crisis one. None of this requires becoming a different person. It requires refusing to keep outsourcing the parts of your financial life that were always yours to hold. Not because a man once needed to co-sign your ambition, but because for exactly 50 years, that was the law. And the muscle memory of that history doesn't vanish just because the legislation did. If this gave you language for something you'd already sensed but never had the words for, subscribe. Every week, we take one more piece of the system you were never handed a manual for, and hand you the manual. And if you want the full foundational breakdown behind everything in this video, that's the pinned video linked right now. Start there next. 50 years ago, a woman needed someone else's name on the paper to be believed. In the next 20, the paper is going to have her name on it, whether she's ready or not. The only real decision left is whether she's the one holding the pen when it happens, or watching again from outside the room.